If you want a comprehensive series of in-depth astrology information in an audiobook format, check out the 4-part Elements series by Stephen Forrest. I had the privilege of narrating it to audiobook, and it's a must for any astrology library. His complete life's work in a 4-volume set. The Book of Fire, Earth, Air, and Water. Direct links to all 4 books are on hightimelinebooks.com or available on Audible and Apple Books. Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast. Okay, I've got one for you, especially those of you who have a few rings inside your tree trunk. Elton John, of course, that name signifies music legacy of this entire generation. In early December, on a Sunday at a concert, he announced that, or a play, I guess it was, he announced that he had lost his eyesight. He was going blind. And this apparently is from an infection that affected his eyes. Well, as astrologers, when you see news like that, you want to take a look at what the chart shows. And as Robert says, if it's not in your natal chart, it's not in your life. So then when we put the transits over that, what was going on in the sky when he made this public announcement, presuming that it obviously had been going on for a while before that, what did the sky look like when he announced this and when it hit the news? And if you look in the show notes right at the top, you'll see a link to be able to view or download that chart. And we'd like to pick it apart because it has some incredible, oh wow. If you did not believe in astrology before listening to this, you will after, especially how it relates to medical astrology. And this one gets a little scary, how close it is. The chart is in the show notes on the audio and description on the video so you can follow along. Robert, let's pick this apart because this is a wowzer.
Well, first of all, this is a solar chart because we really don't have a reliable time of birth for Elton John. So when astrologers don't have a reliable, and by that I mean a timed birth certificate, the best thing, the alternative, is to use what's called a solar chart, which you set up for noon on the day of birth at the location of birth, but then you place the sun on the first cusp. This gives you the moon's position for noon on that day, which can vary 6 degrees on either side of the noon position. So his moon is definitely in Taurus, 6 degrees earlier, which would be 12 hours earlier. It would be at 2 Taurus, and 6 degrees later, which would be 12 hours later than noon, it would be at 14. Or 15. So his moon is definitely in Taurus. But so this is a solar chart, and you can begin and these are absolutely valid. I encourage students to set up their own solar chart. Yes, you may have a time birth chart, but take your computer software and ask it to place the sun on the ascendant and read that chart too. You'll get a lot of supplemental information that is incredibly valuable. So here, Thomas and I were talking about this when it was first reported that Elton John was losing his sight. When he first reported it, he was talking about getting some treatment that he hoped would improve the sight. That didn't happen. So he's lost his sight. Sight is ruled by the 3rd house, basically. Gemini is the natural wheel sign on that house. Gemini rules connectingness. Well, the eyes connect us visually to the environment, the books that we read, the roads that we drive on, and so on. All visual connectivity is ruled by the 3rd house. So is all auditory connectivity, what we hear. So is, as we know, a lot of physical connectivity. The 3rd house rules the hands. It rules the arms, and so on. So you're looking at eyesight from birth, because if it's not in the birth chart, it's not going to happen. And immediately you see the sign of Gemini and Uranus in Gemini, square almost exactly is Mars in Pisces in the 12th, which has to do with hospitals and clinics and so on, but it's also opposite the 6th house of health. And so the 12th house also has a lot to do with health, and it's traditionally the house of secret sorrow and self-undoing. That's the negative side of it. It's also the house of hidden treasures. If you come to understand your 12th house consciously through studying astrology, you get a good handle on how you may be undermining or even destroying yourself. The flip side of that becomes the hidden treasure. I don't know if Elton John's drug use, like most of us in that generation, we experimented with drugs, including alcohol, acid, cocaine, marijuana, who knows what else, pharmaceutical drugs. So I don't know if any of those habits may have contributed to his loss of eyesight. But here we see it. Mars in Pisces, which is inflammatory. The optic nerve itself is ruled by Gemini, like all nerves in the body, connectingness. So Gemini rules the optic nerves. It also rules the nerves and synapses in the brain, the billions of synapses that we have in the brain. So here we have transiting Saturn in Pisces, having gone over Elton John's Mercury, the ruler of Gemini, the ruler of his third solar chart house of vision. Saturn went over Mercury. It's going over his midheaven, and it's going over his Mars, and it's squaring his Uranus. And Uranus in the third house in Gemini, afflicted, so-called square to Mars, can indicate conditions that arise suddenly and unexpectedly, which this did. So there you have it from the transit of Saturn, a slow-moving transit. That's the indication, the immediate indication of this.
Well, with this connection with Gemini in the third and Uranus in the third at 18 degrees, look up at the top of the chart. If you, like I said, if you didn't believe in astrology, you better not raise your hand on this one, because we're going to get you. You've got the planet ruling that, sitting directly to the degree opposite that Uranus. And look at Jupiter.
Yep. It's amazing.
And what were you saying the other day about Jupiter connected to all of this?
Well, Jupiter is opposite. It rules Sagittarius, the opposite sign from Gemini. So Jupiter's Mercury, Jupiter's the higher octave of Mercury, if you want to look at it that way. And in medical astrology, if you have an affliction, we're talking here about the mutable cross, Gemini, Sag, Pisces, and Virgo. You can have afflictions in Pisces or Virgo that can indicate blindness or deafness, even though they're not, because they are square in Virgo, Pisces, they're square, the Jupiter, the Gemini, Sag axis. So Jupiter can play a role as well, just like Mercury does, in auditory or visual illnesses and conditions. So today he has Jupiter in Gemini, of course, transiting right over his Uranus. And again, Jupiter in Gemini exactly square his Mars, exactly squares midheaven and Mercury too previously, but right now. So there are two big major aspects: Saturn in Pisces going over Elton's Pisces planets, Saturn in Pisces squaring Uranus in his third house of vision, in Gemini of vision, and transiting Jupiter, going over that Uranus in Gemini and squaring his Pisces planets. So it's a double whammy.
I found another one, and I know this isn't your specialty or mine at all. I don't pretend to even know anything about it, but Vedic astrology takes a look at the nodes of the moon related to the eyes, particularly what they call Ketu, which is the south node of the moon. And here in this chart, the south node in the sky now, Ketu, is directly opposite his sun. Change in eyesight.
Yes. And two, Thomas, if you look now, the transits of Mercury and Venus, these are minor planets and they're fast moving planets, and they very often by themselves transits of Venus might indicate a pleasant social experience or a negative social experience, and that's about it. But when they are considered in connection with the more major transits, and here today, or what is this for? December 2nd.
This is the reason I did December 2nd. It's the day after. It's really when it kind of hit the news big time because the show was on Sunday.
Interesting when it hit the news because that is exactly the ninth house. That's the media. The third house rules routine communications, emails that we write, phone calls that we make. The ninth house rules collective communications, books that we publish, films that we make, newspaper articles that we write, and so on. And here's transiting Mercury 2 days ago, or 3 days ago, 18 Sag, along with the sun, the life force, in the ninth house of mass media in his chart. So that's when we were informed about this. But here's his life force and Mercury both bringing the square from Saturn and the squares from Jupiter and the conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter that we've just discussed. The Sun and Mercury are bringing those into public consciousness in Sagittarius in his ninth house. And they're also on a personal level. Because Mercury does rule Gemini, and it has a lot to do with the eyesight and hearing, etc., no matter where it is in the chart. So here it is. So it brings this condition home not only to Elton John, but now publicly. And I'm glad that he felt comfortable in announcing it publicly, and why not? These things happen to people. So it's sad on one level. It is sad. But it's life and how we deal with it. How do we deal with misfortune, so-called? But it's fascinating that Mercury is exactly in the same position, exactly opposite Uranus in his third house of Gemini. So there you get further validation that the third house in Gemini, and by expansion, the mutable cross, which is the cadent houses, and the mutable signs, all are triggered right now in his chart in a very exact way.
You know, it's amazing how he has lived his life. His brilliance came out very early. He had the whole drug scene. He questioned his sexual preference and went with what he knew was in his heart to do. And the other thing is he has lived his later years so well, too, from the show in Vegas to the farewell tour to now in his late 70s, he'll be 80 in 2027, that he is, things are winding down for him, and he has wound down graciously. He helped celebrate the Queen in her Jubilee, an amazing performance in London. And he just has, wow, you talk about a life well lived. He's made some good choices along the way, followed his heart, I'm sure, and has done it well.
Yep. And, you can't help thinking with transiting Jupiter and Gemini going over that Uranus, he's suddenly faced with the loss of his eyesight. But that house, the third, rules the mind, and it's Jupiter, and it's the greater benefic. It promises that he has and will continue to adjust to this blindness positively. He's fortunate. He's got a lot of money. He's secure that way, and he has a lot of friends. So he's lost his sight. He'll be fine. Other people might not be. People who have to work until the day they die to earn a living and to have food and shelter, who go blind. It's a different story. So with him, the prognosis, if you will, it's not that he'll regain his sight, but he will adjust very well to it.
Excellent point. Well, thank you for this. This was a wowzer. It really was. And I'm glad that Robert, when I pitched this to him, I said, let's talk about this. He was all over it. So thank you guys for listening. I hope this gives you some really good clues as to how you can look at medical astrology. And, of course, the big wowzer as well is that this happened in such synchronicity with the chart. We'll catch you next time on the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast. Check our show notes for everything going on around here, including the link to Robert's readings, if you'd like to do that. And he has a new website, so that link goes to the new website. You can check that out as well. Thanks so much. We'll catch you next time on the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast with Robert Glasscock.